Hey guys, my name is Ish and welcome to my third and very last video about export settings for sport videos. So this is it. This is the one that most people wanted to see. This is the one where I talk specifically about how I export videos for YouTube, as opposed to the other two, which were how I export videos for clients. So if you remember, my first export settings video was about exporting in 1080p, and the second one was about how to export in 4K. All of that very specific, I was gonna say all of that very specific to sports. It is and it isn't. Like, I do choose these settings with sport in mind, but if you were to use those settings on something else than sports, it wouldn't damage your video. If anything, I think I put a bit more quality in my videos than most videographers because there is more details and more movement in sport videos than in other ones. So yeah, my videos tend to be probably a bit bigger in size, but it is for that reason, because we need in sports that extra data to make sure that the quality of our work doesn't get lost in the export process. Okay, so as I said, this video is dedicated to YouTube exports, and I'm going to talk about two things specifically. One of them is a secret that not a lot of YouTubers know about, and they should definitely make the most of it. And it doesn't even have anything to do with being in sports. It's just a YouTube thing that you should know about. And the second thing is the one setting that I change from my 1080p or 4K exports that I do differently for YouTube. So basically, I'm not going to go through the whole sort of export settings one by one like I did in my previous videos. So if you haven't watched them, you should at least watch one of them, because in this video, basically all I'm going to do is talk about that one change that I do. But before we get there, let's talk about that secret I mentioned first. When you're exporting to YouTube, you have the option to export in the size that you want. You can export in 480p, you can export in 720p, 1080p, or 4K. All these different sizes are compressed by YouTube differently, because as you know, it's not as simple as exporting your video and it looks exactly the same on YouTube. YouTube applies their own compression to your videos, and Facebook does the same, Twitter does the same, Instagram. These companies apply their own settings to your videos, but they do it differently to different sizes. So YouTube compresses a 1080p video differently than it would compress a 4K video, for example. And obviously, they are a lot more gentle and give a bit more quality, a better bit rate to a 4K video than they do to a 1080p video. So the secret is that a lot of the times, not all the time, and I'm gonna get to that in a minute, but a lot of the times, shooting in 1080p, editing in 1080p, but exporting in 4K and uploading in 4K to YouTube, that would most likely give you a better result than just uploading in 1080p. That being said, that better result highly depends on the quality of the 1080p footage from your camera. Like, I filmed with Canon C100 Mark II, and the 1080p on that camera is way better than the 4K on a lot of other cameras. So when I do it, I would use my 1080p footage, stretch it in a 4K sequence, export that in 4K, upload it in 4K to YouTube, and no one would be the wiser. It would look amazing, much better than my previous videos that I would all upload in 1080p. If you did that filming with a lower end camera, which already doesn't look that great, and then when you stretch it to 200%, automatically starts showing more grain. You can see the pixels being stretched out at the end of the process once you're in YouTube. That's not gonna look any better. Basically, if you're stretching your image to 4K and you can already tell that it looks much worse than it did before, don't bother with it. It's not gonna miraculously look better on YouTube. But if it looks just a little bit worse than it did, it's probably gonna look better on YouTube simply because the 1080p compression on YouTube is much harsher. And if you compare the two, and if you don't believe me, just do it. Export the same video in 1080p and then in 4K, upload them both to YouTube in private. You don't have to share them publicly, and just look and see. If it works for you, then do it. If it doesn't, then stick to what you were doing before. Now, when it comes to the export settings themselves, the one thing that I change from what I usually do for clients is the bitrate encoding. If you remember, typically when I export videos, I use VBR 2-pass. VBR stands for variable bitrate. So basically the way it works is that Premiere dedicates the first pass to analyze very thoroughly where in your image should Premiere dedicate the higher bit rates and where it doesn't need to. So the higher bit rates would go in parts of your footage where there's a lot of movement, a lot of details, very busy basically. And then when it's something a bit more, for example, someone like me just sitting there talking to the camera in front of a plain background, it doesn't need as much as a higher bit rate. So it would go down, and Premiere would analyze your entire video like that through the first pass, and then in the second one would just apply the bitrate accordingly. That's the best way to get the best result and yet still keep your file to a reasonable size. Because when you're sending files to clients, you don't want them to be too big because it becomes a pain, not so much for me, but it becomes a pain for them because they're not used to dealing with big files. And most of the time, it's not just, them receiving the file. They usually want to share it internally. They want to send it. Maybe they've got their own clients because you're working with an agency, or they just basically, if it's a promo, they want to, send it to a lot of people. So if it's a huge file, it's a huge pain in the butt for them. But the thing is, if you're exporting for YouTube, then all of a sudden, all those problems disappear. The only person that's gonna have to deal with that file is you. And I don't know about you, but for me, file size and export time are not an issue when I'm exporting for YouTube. The reason is simple. Once I upload a file on YouTube, it's gonna be there until I don't have any plans on deleting anything, so it's gonna be there until YouTube disappears. So I wanna make sure that the file that I upload there, which is gonna be there representing me forever, is gonna be the highest quality that I could have ever put on YouTube. So if I have to wait 3 days for the export to finish, and if I have to end up with a file that's 15 gigs, I don't care. If that's what it takes to get the best result on YouTube, that's what I'll do. All right, so it's that simple. And of course, I'm exaggerating when I say 3 days, but I see a lot of people basically not willing to wait 2 hours or 3 hours for an export and then cutting corners just so that they can upload quicker. What's 3 hours when your video is gonna be there forever? Like, I often have exports, not when I do like tutorials like this, but when I do a documentary that has a lot of effects, a lot of filters, sometimes my exports can go for 8, 10, 12 hours. What do? I do it at the end of the day, and then I come the next morning, I watch the video. If everything's good, then I upload. Like, patience is a virtue. So basically, this is a very long way for me to say that in my YouTube exports, instead of using VBR 2-pass, I use CBR, which stands for constant bitrate. The idea is that constant bitrate, I'm guessing you can understand that the idea is that the bitrate remains the same the entire time, which wouldn't be great if you use a low bitrate. But if you use a bitrate that is so high that it's always gonna be enough and most of the time too much for what you need, then your video is gonna look amazing. Obviously, the downside of that is that it's gonna create very big files. A lot of my YouTube videos are 5 gigs, 10 gigs, 15 gigs sometimes. I know some of you, you don't have that much money, you have a hard drive, your hard drive is maybe 1 or 2 terabytes, and you try to make sure you can keep everything on that. Obviously, for me, this is important because sports videography is what I do. This is my business. This is how I make a living. So I want to make sure that when people watch my videos, they automatically think high quality. I don't want them to be let down by the quality of what they see on my YouTube channel. But maybe for you, it's not that much of a big deal. But if it is, like I said, I use CBR, and in 1080p, I put it at 50 megabits per second. And in 4K, I go all the way up to 100 megabits per second. And I know some of you will think it's crazy, but to you I say, just try it. Next time you edit a video, just export it the way you would normally export it, and then try it with these settings and compare the two. And if you're not impressed with the way I do it, then just stick to your own way. But if you do like the way I do it, but it took an extra 2 hours, then ask yourself, what is 2 hours really? If you're trying to put a video on Instagram, YouTube, all that, and trying to impress people and get clients and get players and teams to hire you as a videographer, what is 2 hours? On that note, I hope you enjoyed all my export settings content, because this is it. Until I get to the point where I'm exporting in 8K, I don't think I'll be making any more video about export settings. So again, make sure you watch my previous videos about exporting in 1080p and 4K if you feel a bit unsure about anything we discussed today. Otherwise, thank you again for watching. My name is E, and I hope I earned the privilege of your time.